It's been almost 50 years since the fall of the secessionist state in eastern Nigeria, known to many as the Republic of Biafra. Biafra was a nation dominated by the Igbo people who tried to create their own country after suffering massacres around the rest of Nigeria. In response to fears of Igbo domination in government, citizens of the northern and western parts of Nigeria led riots against the Igbo communities in the region. These would become known as the anti-Igbo pogroms, where some estimates place the number of Easterners killed at 30,000. At least 1 million people fled back to eastern Nigeria in fear. This created a huge rift between the Igbo and the rest of Nigeria, which prompted the government of eastern Nigeria to threaten secession. There were many attempts at peace, one of which was the Aburi Accord in 1967, but the Igbo were adamant in their desires for secession. On May 30th, 1967, Colonel Emeka Ojukwu declared independence from Nigeria, and from there, the war that would leave a gigantic impact on Nigeria commenced.
The so-called rising sun of Biafra is set forever.
Biafra eventually fell to Nigerian forces, but the wounds from the war still have not healed. Its influence still pervades into Nigerian society today. Despite that though, Nigerians only learn about the subject from their families. Many don't learn about the war in their history classes, but rather from stories from their parents or grandparents that lived through the events. The Nigerian government's lack of desire to approach the topic has led to anger and resentment to fester within Nigerian society, especially among the Igbos or other minority ethnic groups in the southeast. In order for Nigeria to move forward and learn from its past, Nigerians need to be actively learning about the Civil War, rather than pretending it never happened. The desire to pretend the war never happened has led to misinformation about the conflict. Whether they're pro-Biafra or pro-Nigeria, many people are unaware about the nuance and many factors within the war. For instance, Biafra is largely seen as an Igbo-centric war for independence. Many use Igbo and other members of eastern Nigeria interchangeably, despite the fact that 40% of Biafra was full of non-Igbo residents. Eastern Nigeria is full of minority groups that were divided on the war, like the Ija of the Niger Delta region. Minority groups of eastern Nigeria were among the many killed in the pogroms around the country due to them being mistaken as Igbo by northerners and westerners. Despite that though, many didn't want to entirely leave the country like the Igbo. Many simply wanted their own state, which the military leader of Nigeria gave at the beginning of the war. This divided the minority groups from the Igbo and caused distrust between them. Many Biafran soldiers would arrest, loot, and burn down non-Igbo villages in fear that they were working with the Nigerian government against them. Minority groups like the Ibibios or the Ikun found themselves at odds with the Biafran government and were subject to many atrocities. This wasn't solely done by Biafra though. The Nigerian government purposely bombed areas where minorities were located in an effort to gain that area back and obtain the oil there. These events are not known by many and perpetuate the belief that only the Igbo people were victims in the war. There are other examples of information on the war not being as widely known as it should be. For instance, many people within Nigeria only see the war as a conflict that has left an impact on their country alone, but that's far from the truth. The war with Biafra is the first time an African conflict was globally reported on, which caused many around the world to see the horrifying effects of war outside their nations for the first time. Some would say the stereotypical idea of the starving African child originated from people seeing photos of Biafran children malnourished from the blockade imposed by the Nigerian government. People from all over the world demanded that there be action. While many governments were reluctant to publicly act in support of either side in the war, the outrage caused the rise of non-government organizations. Humanitarian groups such as the International Committee of the Red Cross received large amounts of donations from people all over the world for the first time. They started their relief aid in 1967 in the form of medical aid for both sides and had the support of governments from around the world. The ICRC faced many challenges though, because they had to comply with the strict rules for providing aid, which was mandated by the federal government of Nigeria. This made the group very inefficient, especially in September of 1968, when Nigeria imposed a blockade on Biafra in an attempt to starve the nation to submission. The ICRC's aid came to a complete stop in the summer of 1969, when the Nigerian government shot down a Red Cross plane and demanded that their airlifts into Biafra end. The ICRC reluctantly complied with Nigeria's demands, but not without criticism from other NGOs. That wasn't the end of the aid though, because the Red Cross's inefficiency inspired other NGOs to conduct their own airlifts into Biafra against the desires of the Nigerian government. The Joint Church Aid Group was a major airlift into Biafra that managed to prevent an estimated 1 million people from dying of starvation. The airlift had no official airstrip and often had to land without lights to avoid the attention of the Nigerian government, who threatened to shoot down any plane they saw delivering aid. The airlifts were almost entirely civilian operated, which amazed many because of what they were able to achieve. They took many trips back and forth from Sao Tome to Biafra every night and are estimated to have brought 250 metric tons of supplies supplies a night to the struggling nation. The JCA were able to do more than 5,300 missions to Biafra despite its many challenges. The achievements of these airlifts brought NGOs to the forefront of the international stage and are a major impact that Biafra had on the rest of the world. Despite Biafra's struggles and need for aid, the nation was able to impress many by staying in the war longer than expected. A huge reason for this was the Ogbungwe, which was a series of weapons created by Biafra to support the war effort. The country struggled in getting ammunition and arms because most governments around the world were reluctant in supporting a secessionist movement. So the Biafran government started the Research and Production Organization, which was made up of university teachers, research scientists, and engineers from all over Biafra. The group created a surface-to-air missile that achieved minimal success in shooting down aircrafts, but its biggest use was against the troops. The weapon was able to wreck the opposition and push the Nigerian troops back, causing the Biafrans to win battles. RAP's weapon innovations were huge contributions to delaying the fall of Biafra, but it wasn't able to save the country. Some suspect that if RAP was able to achieve its full potential, then Biafra would have stood more of a chance of succeeding, but the invasion of Nigerian troops in Biafra's territory forced RAP to move multiple times in the middle of their work. It also suffered from funding issues because the research group was mostly made to complement the importation of arms and ammunition, so the Biafran government didn't invest as much as it could have. Despite all this though, the achievements of the Ogbungwe are a major legacy of the war in Biafra. Civilian life in Biafra is also a poorly understood subject from the Nigerian Civil War. Many think that life in Biafra was a utopia ruined by the Nigerian government, while others think that the nation was plagued with only starvation and death. The reality is that neither are correct. Life in Biafra was diverse and relative to each person. In fact, Biafra attempted to create its own bank during the war with its own currency. At the beginning of the war, Biafra attempted to continue using the Nigerian currency of the time, but to make their wealth useless, Nigeria took the money out of circulation. In response, Biafra created their own notes and attempted to put it into circulation. The country reached a note shortage though, leaving many Biafrans unable to exchange all their money. Gender roles were also heavily affected by the war. While women didn't join the Biafran army due to beliefs on gender and Igbo culture, many women joined local militias in an effort to contribute to the war effort. Women also found themselves taking the jobs that were originally filled by men before the war. Young girls were taught fishing and hunting, while young boys helped their single mothers perform duties traditionally for women. It wasn't completely great for women though, because many found themselves forced to prostitute themselves to survive in the war climate. Many women also faced sexual harassment from soldiers on both sides of the war. Life for families in Biafra changed as well as the use of the extended family resurged. Many Igbo families found themselves relying on their extended families for shelter and food. Many families found themselves becoming closer in an attempt to retain normalcy in the face of the war. Others had to leave their kids with families they had never met in order to keep them safe. Many of the refugees that fled to eastern Nigeria at the beginning of the war found themselves returning to communal lifestyles they had never experienced beforehand due to living in cities for most of their lives. In fact, Biafra's greatest impact was probably upon its youth. The Biafran government studied propaganda used by other governments and applied it themselves to build the support for the cause. Young children were shown horrifying photos of murdered Igbos from the massacres that led to the war, and sang patriotic songs in support of secession. This created a desire within Igbo children to join the war effort and fight. The Biafran government didn't take young kids for the war at first, but instead recruited 10 to 14-year-olds as spies in Nigeria. These young spies would be called Resi Boys and were sent into Nigerian-occupied territory to blend in and collect information. Unfortunately, the Nigerian government found out and started arresting these boys to force Biafra to put it to an end. By 1967, young boys were brought into the war effort, especially because not many were able to attend school due to food shortages and instability. While many willfully enlisted, many young boys were conscripted due to the army needing more soldiers for the war effort. Ultimately, the youth would suffer the most from the war due to its psychological effects on them. Prior to the war, many Igbo children were kept away from death and taught to fear it. By the end of it though, many were desensitized to death and pain due to the war constantly bringing it to the forefront. After the war, Nigeria's leader Yakubu Gowon declared no victor, no vanquished in an attempt to move forward and unite the country. Biafrans would be forgiven for the war and were promised easy reintegration into Nigeria. Gowon essentially tried to force the country to forget the war and attempt to unite it and move past it. For years, most Nigerians never learned about the Civil War in the classroom because the government refused to acknowledge it. While they have added the Civil War to the history curriculum, there isn't much of an effort to make sure people are aware of it. Most Nigerians are not required to learn history, and many still only learn about the war from their family members. Gowon's declaration had prevented the wounds of Biafra from genuinely healing. Many Igbos still feel marginalized and have hostile relations with their Delta neighbors. Each region and ethnic group has their own memory of the war due to the country not having a unified narrative of it. This contrasts with a place like Rwanda, where the country has actively tried to confront the genocide and heal from it. While ethnic relations aren't perfect in the country, there has been progress. This cannot be said of Nigeria because people feel as if the war is a taboo to talk about. In order for Nigeria to progress, the country needs to learn from its past and discuss its wrongs. Nigerians need to learn about the war and demand that the next generation be taught about it. It won't be easy, but it's necessary in order for true social progress in the country. In order for the Republic to genuinely permanently heal, Nigerians need to acknowledge and confront their past, even if it's painful to discuss, because in the end, ignoring a wound won't make it go away.